This is Metabolic Mastery, a KORR Medical Technologies podcast dedicated to advancing knowledge and practice in metabolic testing. Welcome to Metabolic Mastery, brought to you by KORR Medical Technologies. I'm Dr. Marc Humbert, and this is my co-host, Dr. Cameron Garber. Today, we're going to be talking about aerobic and anaerobic power. So basically, how does your body produce energy using oxygen and not using oxygen? And we're going to talk about why that matters in life, why that matters in performance. We also are going to talk about it in the context of knowing these things for yourself. And so, Cameron, will you start off with telling us a little bit about why it's important to know some of these things, how we can use testing to give us an idea of where we're at?
Doing a really good metabolic test with the CardioCoach is very important for understanding how we can use our energy systems in our training and just our everyday life. Understanding that helps us to know how we can best apply this information to our everyday training and keeping ourselves as fit and healthy as possible. We're in this for the long haul, right? This is a long-term game. And so understanding our energy systems is really important. And so getting a test done with the CardioCoach and getting that just so valuable information about how our energy systems is going to allow us to apply those principles to our training so that we can optimize our training for each energy system, depending on what our activities and what we enjoy doing requires.
Yeah.
And so, let's dive into how the energy systems that we're using play into the power that we're able to generate and types of power and all those fun things.
Absolutely. How many times can we say power?
We're going to say the terms power and capacity so many times today.
Yeah. So let's actually talk about power, because we're going to talk about it in a couple of different ways. We're going to talk about capacity a couple of different ways.
Right.
And so when we're talking aerobic power or anaerobic power, we're talking about the maximum rate at which your body can produce energy in the form of ATP. There's also a different form of power. So that first definition, that max rate of ATP production, is really this idea of metabolic power. A related concept is our mechanical power. So mechanical power is force times distance over time, or work over time. And so our metabolic power is an input into that system, right? And so the energy that we can produce metabolically, our ability to get oxygen where it needs to go using our cardiovascular system, and actually producing the force through our neuromuscular system, is all going to combine together to produce that mechanical output of power. And so it's an expression of our body systems. And so we just want to make that differentiation, so that kind of metabolic power versus mechanical power. And then capacity. And so capacity is really how much energy that we can make, or our energy reserves. You can think of it as the size of our gas tank. How long can we last, producing that aerobic power? How long can we last producing energy anaerobically? And so just to clarify those things. And then there's also, so we've talked about kind of metabolic capacity. Now talk about capacity in some other ways that we like to look at it.
So we often talk about what's our capacity to do work, so mechanical work, right? So our actual performance capacity. And so we have a capacity in terms of like what I'm able to do is kind of my total capacity. But then there's also kind of a idea behind capacity of what can I sustainably do? So what can I actually recover from? And so we often talk about this concept of load versus capacity, meaning the workload that I'm putting on the entire system versus the capacity I have to recover from that load that I put on the system. And so if my capacity to bear that load is lower than the load that I'm putting on, so we're able to put more load on the system, we're able to do more work than our body can actually recover from. So we can produce enough work that it can be somewhat injurious to us if we don't take the right amount of recovery. And so that's an interesting concept in terms of what's our functional capacity versus what's our working capacity that I can do day in, day out and not get injured, not have breakdown from pushing that part.
Yeah.
And so there are a couple different types of capacity that we'll talk about. And we'll try to make sure we're being clear as to which type of capacity or which type of power that we're talking about, whether that's metabolic, aerobic, anaerobic power versus mechanical power. So we'll do our best to define that. We also have some images here. So if you're listening on the podcast, you may want to take a look at some of the images. Again, we'll do our best to kind of describe those things, but it may help to take a quick glance. We'll try to put some of those images in the show notes.
All right. So we've talked about work, we've talked about capacity, we've talked about power. Now let's dive into how our body actually produces that, right? So how are we getting along metabolically? So our body has three main energy systems. And as Cameron said at the beginning, this is going to be really important to understand these energy systems, because that is what fuels the work, that fuels what we're doing.
Right.
And so another thing to understand with this is that while we have these three main systems, we're always using a mix of them. Yeah. And so we're going to talk about them in a somewhat isolated way, but understand that our body is always using these different pathways to just move us forward and accomplish the activity at hand.
Rarely, if ever, are we just using one system.
Yeah. And so the first system is what we call our ATP-CP system. So that's stored ATP in our muscles. We have some amount of that. And ATP, again, is the energy currency of our cell.
Yeah.
And then phosphocreatine. So that's like when you're taking the creatine powder, that is basically maxing out your the muscle cell's ability to store that creatine in there, right? In the form of phosphocreatine. And so that provides us really quick energy. You can think of it like if we're building a fire, you can think of the phosphocreatine as a match, right? That's going to get us started. But a match doesn't burn for very long. And it's really to help us to get to the next stage in energy production. And so typically those stores are exhausted within the first 10 seconds of kind of all out max effort. The nice thing is that these stores can be replenished pretty quickly. So whereas, and we'll talk about glycogen in a second, but while they're used up during the high intensity, if we're having a recovery period, then within the first 30 seconds, they're about 50% recovered. Within the first minute and a half, they're about 70, 80%. And then by 3 to 5 minutes, those stores are fully recovered. And so those can be replenished pretty quickly. And so it's a really nice, very useful system. Whereas that glycolytic system is using our stored muscle glycogen. So talk a little bit about why glycogen is such a cool fuel source, but also why it's limited.
So yeah, glycogen has, so if ATP is kind of the match, you're kind of the next thing down is more of the kindling, right? Mm-hmm. So burns hot, but doesn't burn forever. And so those glycogen stores in our muscles are awesome because it's that instant energy, like it's really there and readily available. But our storage is usually limited to our muscle size and the amount of fluid we can retain in our muscles and things like that. So we can train those systems to hold more. But that's still somewhat limited compared to fat storage, which is more like a big oak log that can burn forever and ever. It's got a ton of energy in there and can burn really long, but it's not quite as hot. And so that the glycogen stores are awesome because of the amount of heat they can produce, essentially in that same analogy.
Yeah.
So we can produce a ton of heat or work really, really quickly, but that energy storage form is somewhat limited. And so awesome for quick efforts or more explosive activities. Obviously, the most explosive activities are with those ATP system, but that it can still do more of that sustained high intensity work. And so awesome there that it can do that.
Well, and one of the limitations, again, is we only have so many stores and they take much longer to be replenished than does that ATP-CP system. Mm-hmm. And so,
yeah, that's,
it's hours up to a full day, depending on the intensity of the activity. And so, and then like camera mentioned, fat is, we basically have unlimited energy from that.
Right. So much.
Yeah. So now that we understand that a little bit better, and I guess let's talk really quick about what kinds of things that those might be used in. And so that ATP-PC system might be like, I'm doing a really quick jump or this very fast sprint.
Yeah.
And this is that 0 to 10 seconds. Well, actually, let's talk about this graph. We can use the graph to talk about that. Can you go over that?
Well, so essentially each system has the amount of intensity that we can produce with it. So that ATP system, we can do very, very high intensity work. It's just very short bursts. But it produces enough energy for those high intensity stuff. Glycolytic, we can last quite a bit longer, but, and at higher workloads. And then our oxidative systems can't produce as much work. And we can increase that with training, but it still isn't going to produce as much work, but we can usually sustain that for much longer periods of time. And again, with that concept of what's our capacity to produce that energy versus what's our capacity to recover from it. My capacity to recover from it may be here, whereas my capacity to produce that energy system may be a little bit higher. And so that's where we can train ourselves into injuries and things like that, is by kind of overreaching. Because I'm capable of doing it doesn't always mean I'm capable of recovering from it. So here we can do a lot longer efforts and still recover from it. Whereas here, our capacity may be right here to recover. And there we're typically not as likely to get injured unless we're not warmed up or something like that, if we're doing sprints. And that's usually a different type of injury where it's just tweaked your hammy because you weren't warmed up or things like that. But yeah, the more time you spend under each of these can increase that injury risk. As my background is in physical therapy, I think of everything in how do we train this system while avoiding injury?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of a filter through which I see everything, because that's the biggest hindrance to consistency. And that's where progress really happens, is by being consistent. And so I kind of think of everything in terms of how do we train sustainably so that we can stay in the game and avoid injury. And so when I think of energy systems, that's what I think of. How do we maximize performance and maximize the improvement we get out of it while avoiding injury?
Yeah. Well, and I think thinking about it in this way of energy systems is so helpful, because it helps us see through a lot of the conflicting information that's on social media.
Yeah.
Because what ends up happening sometimes is that people basically unknowingly sometimes pick their favorite energy system, right? Well, my favorite energy system is that fast, high intensity energy system, right? Or my favorite energy system is that one that allows for the long, slow efforts. And the truth is that we want to do things that train all of those so that we maximize our capacity in all of those domains. And so we'll see this in the arguments of high intensity versus low intensity versus moderate intensity. Like, if we're only training one, then we're missing out on training these other energy system, and we're leaving gains, we're leaving performance, we're leaving longevity really on the table.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I like looking at it that way. And in this graphic that you'll see in the video version, it kind of has these.
Yes, I didn't explain it very well.
And as we mentioned before, we're always using all of these energy systems, but we're looking at this on a scale of intensity and then duration. And so this is really about the primary energy system being used. So at that high intensity and short duration, the primary energy system used is that ATP PC system. And then at that next level, we're going to be using that glycolytic system as the energy system. So not quite as high intensity, a little longer duration. And then that oxidative system, that's going to be much longer duration, not quite high intensity. We can basically keep that going forever.
Right.
Essentially.
Right. Well, and so we've kind of shaded in the area under the curve with each of these, and there is overlap on the area under the curve with each of these, which kind of represents the fact that we're never using just one system, one energy system.
Absolutely. All right. So we've got power versus capacity. We've got energy systems. let's now talk about the different types of power and capacity. So we'll start off with anaerobic power and capacity. And so that anaerobic power is really our maximum rate of energy that can be produced without oxygen. And so again, that refers to that ATP system, but and stored creatine. And I was on so many different terms.
PC.
PC, CP, PCR,
Yeah.
all refer to the same thing. But anyway, so that anaerobic power is really a combination of that ATP-PC system and the glycolytic system.
Right.
And so we don't have to have oxygen to do that. So oxygen we're using within the mitochondria to fuel that energy. That non-oxygen energy being produced is happening in the cytosol of the cell, so just outside of the mitochondria. Anyway, and so this anaerobic power is of relatively short duration, right? That maximum rate of ATP production that we can get out of those systems is pretty high, but it doesn't last very long. You can kind of think of the anaerobic power as your turbocharger or as your NOS,
Yeah.
right? Like we'll go really quick, really fast. And then with anaerobic capacity, it's how long can I produce that anaerobic work for? And so relatively short, right? So if we're only using these two systems, those are exhausted within about 90 seconds at the maximum end. And so that anaerobic gas tank isn't super large. And the nice thing is it can be replenished pretty quickly, at least on that ATP side.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other thoughts about the anaerobic power?
Well, yeah, in training that's, when we talk about how to train that and why metabolic testing is important, is we can see where those thresholds are. And with those thresholds, then we can know better how we can train those systems. And so we know how intense we need to get to actually be training those systems. So that can be really, really helpful to know, okay, here are where my anaerobic threshold is, and here's where my VO2 max is. And so to train those systems, you want to be closer to your VO2 max. You want to do more VO2 max training where you're going all out efforts at high intensity. And so for somebody just starting out, that's probably not where we want to start out, is training those types of systems. That we can build on that as somebody gets more fit and gets more sports specific in their training. But initially we want to focus more on just the frequency and duration of their training, of building them up and getting to where their exercise is more meaningful. And then as they develop more, capacity, in terms of capacity to bear the loads of exercise, then we can start working more on the high intensity systems. And so that's where I think a lot of people get kind of steered in the wrong direction, is when they start out training higher intensity systems that aren't really as sustainable, that require a lot more recovery, and their injury risk then becomes a lot higher. And so that's where I would say those systems are very important, especially for sports participation and for those quick burst things like, oh my gosh, my grandkid just ran out into the road and I need to go get them. That's your glycolytic system and your ATP-PC, or whatever, PC system is those types of efforts of like, oh my gosh, something just happened and I need to respond. And so it's important to have that capacity to do those types of things, from a longevity and a survival and a living life on my terms, where my body's not dictating what I can and can't do. But that may not be the best place to start when we're getting in shape.
Yeah, absolutely. As we always say, the only training that matters is training that you can recover from.
Yeah.
And so we just want to balance that carefully. We're actually looking at some research yesterday that was talking about injuries, right, in running training.
Yeah.
And that it's often attributed to this really big increase in either intensity or in duration of the activity, above and beyond what we've already been doing.
Right. So what they found, it doesn't have as much to do with total volume of training. So runners have always used this 10% rule that you shouldn't increase week over week by more than 10%. And there's actually no evidence to suggest that. That's just been kind of a rule of thumb.
And not a bad rule of thumb.
No, yeah, a good rule of thumb, but a 10% increase if you're running at 100 miles a week, a 10% increase is fairly significant. If you're running 30 miles a week, a 10% increase isn't as significant. And so it's all relative.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's 10% increase. Are we talking training intensity? Are we talking training volume? Are we, so there's differences there in what that 10% increase can look like, but there's really not a whole lot of evidence to it. But what they found is that most injuries actually come after a single day spike where they went longer or more intense in one day than they have in kind of the average workout over the last month or so. And so that's the thing. And we see this all the time. I tell this story a lot because I've seen it so often. Disneyland being the destroyer of runners. So they are really consistent in their running, and then they go on vacation and they keep up their running because they've got, XYZ race coming up. So they continue to do their running. Plus they get an extra, 40,000 steps in for 2 or 3 days in a row at Disneyland. And they don't think of that as part of their training, but it's time under load. It's time on your feet. It's time not allowing those tissues to recover. And all of a sudden you've just pushed yourself very acutely over your work capacity, and injuries happen. And so really common that something like that, an amusement park, can take an otherwise very healthy, very fit person and push them over the edge. And so we just have to be careful with the total amount of load we're putting on the system. Because again, we have kind of two different types of capacity. We have our capacity of what we can do. I mean, they were able to go on their run in the morning and stand all day at Disneyland.
Yeah.
Or wherever. I don't mean to call out Disneyland. It's any amusement park. Be the culprit. But yeah, that's just the thing, is their body can do it. It's just they weren't able to recover fully from it.
Well, I think, we have this with people that are already training, but also I think this is one of the things that drops people out of exercise when they're first getting into it again.
Right.
They hear like, oh man, like you can increase your VO2 max really quickly with high intensity activity. We hear all this harping on the high intensity. And again, don't get us wrong. High intensity is important.
So important.
Part of a good, healthy training plan for longevity, right? We need that high intensity. But when that's our intro into exercising after we haven't exercised in a while, then that can lead us into injury really quick, burnout and fatigue.
Yeah. So I'm a big believer in the 80-20 system that, 20% of our load of our total, time of training should be high intensity and 80% should be low intensity. But starting out at 80-20 may not be right for the individual. If they haven't been training, 80-20 is probably too much initially, especially depending on how much total volume of training they're doing. And the application of 80-20 may be a little bit different too. If you're doing 80-20, where I do 4 days of low intensity and then 1 day of high intensity, my body may not be ready for an entire day's worth of high intensity.
Yeah.
Versus doing, of those 5 days a week, doing, a few minutes of each of those days at high intensity may be a little bit more tolerable, initially. And so we can build that up as we increase our capacity to do the high intensity stuff. We can consolidate that and have longer high intensity workouts and get more bang for our buck out of that as well. And so it really is, I recommend a lot of people, we start at like 99.1 and then 95.5 and then 90-10 and then, build up to the 80-20 so that we allow their body to adapt to just training in general, if they haven't been training, but also then adapt to high intensity training, because those do put higher amount of workloads. And so tendon resilience has to be much, much higher. Our ligament and bone density has to adapt to that and be okay with those types of intensities. And so it's important to let our body adapt to that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we can get a lot of stimulus from those high intensity.
Oh, we can see a huge change in a very short period of time. So a lot of studies, we were looking at that last week, actually. A lot of studies will show like HIIT training is really, really beneficial. And if you do a few things of HIIT training, blah, blah, blah. The problem is most of these studies only last 6 to 8 weeks, and they are great at building up these systems and increasing our overall capacity to do high intensity work. So all of a sudden you can run again, or you can go get your kid out of the street again. The problem is they're not typically very sustainable. And these short duration studies of 6 to 8 weeks, we often don't see the injuries come in those 6 to 8 weeks. But when we do, HIIT studies that are 6 months or things like that, we see quite a bit more in terms of injuries, problems.
Yeah. So that reminds me of an interesting paradigm. It was first proposed by what's her name? I can't remember if it's Karen or Karin Silbernagel, but one of the really big researchers in the tendon world. And that, I remember this graph that showed, it was like when we see pain or when we see injury. And I don't love the phrase, but it showed this period of what called abusive training that was below the threshold of pain, that was below the threshold of injury. Right. Yeah. And so that we're training, but we're actually overreaching in a non-functional way. And it may take time for that to actually show in terms of pain or in terms of loss of function.
Right.
And so again, while we need that high intensity, while it's important, if we're only observing this over a short period of time, that may not be enough time to see the effects of that non-functional overreaching, right?
Right.
We need to push ourselves a little bit to push our capacity up. But if we overdo that, then we're actually not recovering enough. We're not actually seeing the adaptations that we want. Instead of saying the tissues build up so that our tendons are more resilient, our muscles, ligaments are more resilient, the tissues actually start to break down over time. Same thing with bone, is because we're not allowing enough recovery capacity for that.
Yeah, bone is an interesting one. Bone gets bored very quickly with repeated activity. So walking and running is actually not very good for bone.
Yeah.
Whereas jumping activities, running, cutting, so tennis, volleyball, things like that, actually those athletes have much higher bone densities than runners do.
Yeah.
Because there's kind of this, I don't know if that applies as well, but the law of diminishing returns, that more isn't necessarily better when it comes to bone loading.
Yeah. Yeah. But that's doing some of those high intensity activities, right? We're doing we're doing drop jumps, or we're doing, jumps from multiple angles, or we're doing some sports sort of cross training where it's volleyball or racket sports or something like that, where we're having that high impact. That can be a component of our high intensity training. But just understanding that we can do a lot longer in terms of duration than we can handle in intensity, right? It's not this linear thing. And so understanding that for every increase in intensity, it requires a much greater, we need more recovery than for more duration. That makes sense.
Yep.
So, all right. So now we talked anaerobic power. Let's talk aerobic power. So aerobic power now is using our oxygen to produce that energy. And so aerobic power is that maximum rate of ATP production using our oxidative system. And so typically not quite as high in terms of intensity we can go. But having that ability to produce aerobic power is really important. Aerobic capacity, again, is the size of that gas tank. And so how long can I last in aerobic efforts? And that gas tank is really big, especially if we keep things at a low enough intensity. We can effectively go for days and days using those oxidative systems to fuel our energy.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive what people are capable of.
Absolutely. And so why now is aerobic power, aerobic capacity important? The biggest reason is because that's a lot of what we do, right? Most of our days are not just filled with high intensity after high intensity after high intensity activity. It's when we're moving, right? It's at that fairly low intensity. And so we want to have, for basically any sport that we're looking at, we need some level of aerobic base. But just for longevity in general, we want to have a really big aerobic base. We want those systems to be tuned up well. That means that we can transport oxygen where it needs to go. Right? We get it into the bloodstream. We have a lot of capillaries that can take that to the muscles. And then we have a lot of mitochondria that can process that oxygen and use it to create energy. And so the more tuned up that system is, the healthier we are, right? The longer and better we tend to live.
Yeah.
With those. So, and we need that again so like the endurance runner, that's going to be really important in your half marathon, your marathon efforts.
Yeah.
Again, we're still using that glycolytic system. But really those long duration efforts are where that is really going to shine, versus going back to the anaerobic power really quick. We're going to see that in sprints, 200 meter, 400 meter, or even in sports, right? That running and cutting.
Yeah. Like football players, things like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
So anything to add on aerobic power, or do we want to dive into what that looks like in terms of different sports and training?
Oh yeah.
Let's do that.
I'm on another train.
Okay. So we're going to talk about another graph. So we're going to do our best to describe that for you, paint a beautiful picture for you. So let's talk about how these systems work together in terms of some of the different sports. We'll use 3 main sports to kind of talk about this. And then why both the aerobic power and anaerobic power and capacity is important in those.
Yeah.
Take it away.
So imagine kind of a pyramid shaped triangle, right? That's kind of how I like to view the kind of intensity versus duration. So when we're talking about workloads with different types of athletes. So the broader the base of that pyramid, the more duration they can sustain. So the more endurance they have, right? The taller that pyramid is, the more capacity they have for producing a lot of high intensity work. So we've got the intensity of effort is the vertical, and the duration or endurance of that activity is the base. So if we have a endurance runner, for example, it's this black pyramid here where we've got a huge duration of capacity, but then a lower ceiling there, right? A lower peak. Whereas if we've got a football player or a hockey player that have very short durations of play intensity between rest periods, but require high amounts of work, right? Just insane amount of effort, but for short durations, and then they get a rest. So that's this blue curve here. And then the red is going to be more of your soccer players, tennis players, things like that. They still require a high amount of work, but also have to be able to sustain that over time. And so different types of athletes have different training profiles. And it's hard for an athlete to have all of those training profiles. So the area under the curve is kind of the time under load that is required to train that system. So to be able to have this broad base, you have to train a lot of time, but at lower intensities. To be able to train those high peaks, you don't necessarily need as much time under training, but you need a lot more high intensity training to get there. And more time under training may lead to more injury, depending on your capacity. So why couldn't we have somebody that has the same duration and the same intensity as has the same intensity capacity, so the same speed and whatever, as our high end athletes that require those high end capacities, I guess, versus the duration capacities? Why can't we have both of those things or all of that, right? Well, so when we talk about time under load, we're talking that equals the amount of frequency of our workouts. So how often we're working out, multiplied by the duration of how long each workout bout is, kind of then filled in by the intensity of that. And so when we're talking that frequency, duration, and intensity, to have all 3 of those components becomes very challenging. So, endurance athletes tend to have a high frequency and high duration, but relatively low intensity. Whereas some of your higher intensity athletes are going to have less frequency. They tend to actually still have high frequency, but the durations are shorter. they're not running for more than, 10 to 30 seconds at a time. And most football plays, for example, are done within 30 seconds. Well, even shorter than that. Most are done within like 6 to 10 seconds. Hockey, most of the players are only out on the ice for a couple of minutes at a time before they're swapping out. And if you watch a hockey sideline, they're always hopping in and hopping out. And so it's one of the only sports where you don't have to call a timeout to sub players in and out, or when there's not a dead ball or puck or whatever. They rotate on the fly so that they can go all out intense, but then they're swapping out all the time. And so interesting, that blend of frequency, duration, intensity is really important to get right. And actually, when we're working with somebody that's just starting out in fitness or that's looking to improve their fitness from where they're currently at, this is the order of operations that we go in as well. We don't increase the intensity first because their capacity to recover from that isn't there yet. So first we focus on frequency. So if you're a 3-day-a-week runner and you decide, I want to go Boston qualify, I would not recommend starting to run harder at first, or to start running longer times at first. Instead, it's let's keep the 3 days a week and then increase to a 4th day and then increase to a 5th day. Let's build your total capacity to bear volume of training. And then we'll work on the duration of each effort. And then we'll work on the intensity. And studies have shown that order tends to lead to fewer injuries because it's a safer way of building up the capacity, because you don't get as much accumulated load. When we're looking at the workload from a mechanical standpoint, we can really increase our workload fast by increasing the intensity, by increasing the force. That tends to build that up really, really fast. And so that distance can too, if we're trying to do longer distances in shorter amount of time. And so increasing the work is usually where injuries happen. The time, as long as we keep the work low, is typically not. And when we look at that mathematically, that kind of makes sense.
Well, you said earlier, like this really is it's a game of trade-offs, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think understanding a couple of things. One is that we don't live in a world of unlimited time and unlimited resources, right? We have constraints on what we can do in a given day. And to that point, when we look at professional athletes, that is their job. That's their career. And so they have a better ability than kind of your common person to spread out this, base and increase that peak of that triangle to a greater ability than someone that is like, hey, I've got a job and I've got multiple kids to take care of and I have these responsibilities and I'm also trying to train, right? Like maybe difficult to get that peak quite as high, or maybe difficult to get that base quite as wide, right? And so this is the thing to understand, is that we can't optimize for everything at once. And so in our training, right, like if we're looking to perform better for a specific sport, then we're going to adjust our training. And then just in terms of longevity, right? If I'm training for longevity, it's going to look a lot different. And what we want to see is we have like a decently high peak, but we've also got a broad base. Mm-hmm. And I feel like a lot of times we find that people are on one end of the spectrum or the other, right? They're like, I will exercise forever, right? Like I will work on that low intensity side of things. I'll build that base as wide as you want, but don't make me do the high intensity stuff. Or the opposite, right? Like, oh, I will hit those things hard. I will do that high intensity, but do not make me go for a long time.
But I only have a half hour a day to put to it.
Yeah. And so like, if we're really looking at being that well-rounded individual and keeping our health span large, as we also work to live longer, right, by keeping our body systems tuned up, then having that balance of low and high intensity, such that we're able to push that top end, but keep that really big base, ends up being important. Yeah. And this is one of the really nice things about being able to test these things, because especially when we're testing CO2, like you can do with the CardioCoach Max or the Pro, we're looking at your VO2 max, which really is a measure of aerobic power, right? What's that max capacity of that system? But then when we can look into how your body is using different fuels, right? How are you using fat versus carbohydrate during an effort, and pinpoint like, oh, you know what? We actually need some work. You're not really great at switching over to fat as a fuel source. And so we're going to want to do some more low intensity training. Or wow, you hit that anaerobic threshold really quickly. We're going to need to do some more high intensity training to push that up a little bit higher so that you can buffer those metabolic byproducts and keep going for longer. Or, you know what, VO2 max just isn't very high. Like, we're going to need some low intensity work and some high intensity work to push that up and to improve cardiovascular health and fitness. And so being able to look into some of those different metrics with the testing can really help us pinpoint, hey, this is the next right step in your training plan.
Yeah.
And so it's not just descriptive of where we are, but allows us to be prescriptive with that data.
Yeah. And so we kind of have this chart of like, for different athletes, what do they need?
Mm-hmm.
And so being able to test somebody and seeing where they're at really helps us to dial in like, okay, here's what where their training deficits may be and where we need to focus our training. So do we want to, I think let's go through these.
Yeah.
So like a power lifter, well, let's define the categories. So we have anaerobic and aerobic power, which is essentially how much of that do I need to deliver quickly,
mm-hmm.
versus the capacity, which is how much do I need to be able to sustain that.
Yep.
Right. So anaerobic power wise, a power lifter has a high need for like, I need to deliver a ton of energy really quickly.
Yep.
Capacity, we don't necessarily need to sustain that. And then aerobic power, I don't need to continue to deliver energy, or capacity. I don't need that to be very big. A bodybuilder is kind of in between there a little bit, where it needs still a lot of anaerobic power. It needs more capacity because you've got to do longer amount of, reps to get more hypertrophy. And so you're building that system differently. So you have more capacity to continue to deliver that. And then, but you don't need as much aerobic. You don't need those quick acting energy systems as much. Or you only need the quick acting energy systems, not the sustained energy systems, the aerobic power as much, or aerobic capacity. Then you've got an MMA fighter, or a soccer or hockey player. And these guys are balanced. They need it all. So their training is tough.
Yeah.
And there's a reason why we see a lot of injuries in those types of sports, because they need both high aerobic power. So they've got to be able to go really fast, really hard, but also have a lot of aerobic and anaerobic capacity.
Yep.
So they have high anaerobic and aerobic power and high anaerobic and aerobic capacity. Training volumes have to be really high. Soccer players play all year round a lot of the time. And so, that being able to sustain that requires a high volume of training to be able to have those high capacities. And so, yeah, that's something where they need all of it. MMA fighters, same kind of a thing. They need that to be able to do kind of it all and last long enough to not get their head beat in.
No, absolutely.
Next is kind of marathon runners, and they're the flip opposite of your power lifters and everything,
yep.
Where they don't need to go high intensities. They don't need the sprint speed necessarily or that sprint capacity, but they need high aerobic power and aerobic capacity. And triathletes, cyclists are doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Where they need that ability to deliver a ton of aerobic capacity and power, because there's hills and other challenges or sprints and things like that. They need to be able to deliver that for a very long.
Absolutely. And so I like what you said is that they still need some of each quality, right? Whether you're on the anaerobic power end with the power lifter or the aerobic end with the runner and triathlete, like you're still going to need those qualities for the marathoner, right? You need to be able to do those sprints maybe at the end, right? You're right by the finish line. I'm going to pass these people. And so I have enough reserve there. And then on that power lifter, you need the ability to recover with the aerobic system. And
right.
So that's where that is really important. You might know someone who is a weightlifter that actually is in such poor cardiovascular shape that they have a difficult time getting through their workout.
Yeah.
Like you need some aerobic capacity to be able to recover from and sustain longer workouts.
Right. So time under load is an important factor. And if your recovery in between sets is diminishing the time that you can be under load of working, of lifting, it takes you either more time for your workout, or you're in that same amount of time, you're just getting fewer reps in. So you're getting less time under load.
Yep.
And so that's an important thing for powerlifters. That's honestly one of the things that the Russians always have said about the Americans is we lift too heavy too often historically in our kind of training mentalities, versus just putting more time under load and allowing your body to adapt, and your tendons and ligaments and muscles to adapt to being under load. And so you get prettier muscles, more hypertrophy often when you do it that way, but not necessarily always. And that sometimes depends on body types and muscle fiber types and things like that. You don't always get as much strength or force production out of that. And so, yeah, interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think this would actually be an interesting, we're going to take a little side tangent on
We
this.
never do that.
We never do that. But, like I want to talk about the strength training side of things, is because while like that actual lifting part is mostly anaerobic, right? That recovery part is aerobic, and it's that aerobic period of time that we're recovering that ATP and creatine phosphate. And so you remember at the beginning, I talked about within about 30 seconds, about 50% of that capacity is restored. Within 90 seconds, 70, 80%, and then 3 to 5 minutes, that's restored again. So that, like to Cameron's point, if I'm really working on max strength is specific. What I mean by that is that the expression of force is specific to the activity that you're doing. And so for those powerlifting lifts, when you're practicing those in training, you want to be as fully recovered as possible so that you can give that maximum expression of force. And if you have a poor aerobic recovery capacity, you're not going to be able to resynthesize that ATP as quickly. And that means, to Cameron's point, either the workouts are going to take crazy long amount of times, or you're just not able to get as much time under load because you can't recover fast enough in the constraints you have.
Well, and so it does require aerobic capacity and aerobic power to recover from during lifting. But so I get asked that all the time. Isn't that cardio though? Because my heart rate is getting up and whatever. And even though you do have to use those systems to recover, that's kind of your default system anyway for just life and recovery. But it's not training those systems per se. And so no, lifting is not cardio. It doesn't do the same thing as sustained cardiovascular training. And so even powerlifters should do sustained cardiovascular training, sustained, workloads in cardio. And a lot of them don't like it. And you'll hear the phrase cardio decreases gains. And that is partially true if cardio is done incorrectly. And again, why VO2 testing is and VCO₂ testing with the CardioCoach is so important is we can find out where is that threshold where cardio decreases gains, where you're depleting your body of those glycolytic systems of your, not ATP so much, but also of your glycogen stores in your muscles, of the ability to like work in a sustained way. And so that's why we can test that and see where should a power lifter do their cardio so that they have enough cardiovascular capacity, aerobic power and capacity to recover quickly and put more time under load while still like not robbing their body of the substrates they need for their powerlifting. So cardio can decrease gains if we're, zone 3, zone 4, kind of killing ourselves on the treadmill in between lifts or on days we're not lifting. Yeah, that can decrease gains. But if we stay in, at that fat max point or at a point where we're burning a high amount of fat and a low amount of carbohydrate, we're actually not robbing our body of those substrates, and we're able to do more work because we recover quickly, and so we can put more time under load.
Absolutely. And I think just understanding how these energy systems work in our body.
Yeah.
And there's a difference between using the energy system during a workout or effort and training that energy system to maximize that capacity or maximize that power. And so again, back to the weightlifting example, what we need to increase that aerobic capacity is just a lot of time under load at that low intensity.
Yeah.
Because it's teaching our body different things, right? We have to, like, our heart's having to pump for a really long period of time, right? It needs to deliver the oxygen. So we're getting stimulus for the heart to get better at contracting, the stimulus for more capillary growth. And we're getting energy depletion in the type 1 fibers, right? So the type 1 fibers are going to be more active in those long sustained efforts. And so having that over a long time, because they're so oxidative, because they can produce energy with a lot of fat, it takes a lot to deplete the glycogen in those fibers.
Mm-hmm.
But when the glycogen in those type 1 muscle fibers gets depleted, that is one of the signals to get even better at those kind of adaptations that are related to oxidative metabolism. Also, just the repeated muscle contraction over a long period of time is another stimulus for those adaptations. And so again, thinking of it in terms of what energy system am I primarily training with this activity so that I can get the expression of that aerobic power or aerobic capacity, anaerobic power, anaerobic capacity.
Well, and from a recovery standpoint, this is kind of another aside. From a recovery standpoint, doing that low intensity work, one of the things that really does that helps reduce soreness and other problems is it just moves fluid in and out of those muscles that allows for substrate to get in and waste product to get out. So it really boosts recovery. So that was totally an aside thought.
But again, I think just understanding this, I think some of the, so one, many of the arguments and disagreements that we have over training exercise come from people with different goals and different timelines talking past each other, right? That's a big thing. But part of it is that we just don't understand physiology. And don't get me wrong, like physiology can get very complicated, right?
Oh, it's super.
You go into mechanisms, you go into biochemistry, like that gets above my pay grade at a certain point. But having a basic understanding of physiology, how our body works, how our body is using the food that we eat to produce energy, and how those energy systems work together really gives us a good idea of how and what we want to target so that we can optimize for whatever activity, whatever sport we're doing, but also that we can do that while also looking at the long term and saying, hey, how do I live at the highest quality of life for the longest period of time?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Often we like to make it complicated with all of this stuff, which is fun to look at and whatever, but it's more about being consistent and just staying in a range where we can keep doing it. And as we try to optimize each of those systems, we really can make it more sustainable. And so it is important to get nerdy enough to understand the principles behind it. And then, not stress about that so much once we have a good plan in place, and then focus more on just being consistent with doing it. And so really, really helpful though, when we can say, okay, here's the amount of time I need to train this system for what my goals are. So if you don't have some kind of high intensity activity, a tennis, a volleyball, a sport or of something, it's a good idea to get one because it gives you a purpose for your training. It focuses your training. So just to train to be the most, fit 85-year-old that can be often doesn't focus our training very much versus having specific tasks or specific goals that we want to train for. So oftentimes if some of our clients in the clinic didn't have specific training, like, oh, I'm a tennis player, I love to play tennis, or I love to play whatever, or I love to do triathlons. If they didn't have something like that, we'd often say, let's create then what are the top 10 things you want to still be able to do when you're 85 or 100 or whatever, what are those things like? I want to still be able to carry groceries for 2 blocks or
luggage in an
overhead compartment. I still want to be able to pick up a 30-pound grandkid. And so those are all great goals. What do I need to be able to do now then to be able to sustain that? If I want to pick up a 30-pound grandkid and hold them, like that's doing a goblet squat with at least a 30-pound weight, if not more, in your 50s. If you want to be able to do that at 85, should that goblet squat then be with a 75-pound weight or more? Like, what does that need to look like to be able to sustain those workloads later in life? That's what we really want to get to, is what do I need to be able to do in my training to get where I want to go?
Absolutely. Being able to balance that training stimulus with the ability to recover.
Yeah.
And understanding that, again, that high intensity can drive adaptations really well, requires more recovery. That low intensity, it takes longer duration, but we can do a lot of that. And so understanding that in terms of our aerobic, our anaerobic systems, aerobic power capacity, anaerobic power capacity, gives us an idea of, okay, like, what am I doing already that's working well? Right? I already have a high VO2 max, right? I have a pretty high anaerobic threshold. I have these abilities. Or, oh, you know what? I can sprint really quickly, but I don't last long at all. Or I can last for a long time, but I'm just so slow. It gives an idea of what energy system I need to work on to better express that characteristic that I'm trying to.
Yeah. So here's a real life example, and it's one that I got a lot in the clinic. And I've walked for 4 to 6 miles a day for 35 years. And like, that's always kept me in shape and always helped out, blah, blah, blah. But now I find that when I'm doing yard work, I trip and stumble more, or I've had a few falls, or now that same 4 to 6 miles is taking me 3 hours when it used to take me 90 minutes or whatever, like it's gotten out of hand. And so now I'm only doing 2 or 3 miles instead of the 4 to 6 or things like that. But I've walked for years and years and years. And so again, they've trained one system pretty well, but have kind of ignored the other systems. And so if we want to keep them from falling, if we want to improve their speed again so that they're able to get more miles in the same amount of time and all those things, we need to train some of those other systems. And so that's where we say, okay, at the end of your walk, I want you to take the last 100 yards and try to jog it. Or, so we add in a few things like that. If they're capable of jogging, we test that out in the clinic and stuff and see where they're at there. But, or fast walk it or whatever. Or for the first, anyway, there's lots of strategies that you can do with that. But then we add in strength training. Like, let's just get your legs stronger again. Because the walks kind of slow down the slowing down, but it's still, maintenance is a lie. If we're not improving our fitness, we're dropping off because time and age and all those things. So we have to be improving to level out aging. And so let's get strength training again. Let's do some of these higher intensity type things. One of my favorite things to do with people over like 65, 70 is jump training. Get them jumping again. It is so fun to watch an 85-year-old do a 5-inch box jump, which, doesn't seem that impressive, but it's actually incredibly difficult from a confidence standpoint, all kinds of things. But if you can get them jumping again or bounding again, so 5-inch box jump, and then we do a broad jump as well and try to see how far you can get. And to see, an 83-year-old do, I think she got one of the patients that was kind of a rock star with this, just because she trusted so much and she would just do it. But she got to like a 20 or 22-inch broad jump, which is pretty awesome.
Yeah.
And like, again, it's all relative to where we're at. But for somebody that hadn't run since she was 27, she remembered the day when she went to chase one of her kids. I asked her that question. When was the last time you ran? It's one of my favorite questions to ask people. But when was the last day you ran? And she could remember the day. She was at Green Pond up by the Snow Basin Ski Resort. She was hiking to Green Pond, and her 2-year-old daughter, ran away from her, and she was worried that she was going to fall in the pond. And so she chased after, and her knee hurt, and she thought, oh, running must be bad for me. And she said, oh, I wish I had known then. Because now I understand that my knee hurting when I ran didn't mean that running was bad. It just means that I needed to run more, that I needed to get my body attuned back to running. And I was like, there it is. She sees the big picture. Unfortunately, we're 83 when she saw the big picture.
Better now than never.
But yeah, but she was able to do stuff again.
Yeah.
And her sister kind of saw the big picture decades ago, apparently, because her sister was like 3 years older than her, 86. She has a sand volleyball court in her backyard and she plays almost every day.
That's so
at
cool.
86.
So
and I was like, that's amazing. She's like, I would love to play with her again. You know, it's been 50 years since I last played with her. But I would love to play with her again. But she had eliminated running, was kind of one of the first things. And then, you know, that kind of cascaded into all these other things. And to see her like wish that she could do those things again. But introducing just some power training, you know, some high intensity type work. And then with her cardio, just doing little bits of higher intensity at first, really increased her capacity. And now that, you know, 4 to 6 mile walk was back within reach within a reasonable amount of time.
I want to highlight what you said, because I think this is such an important point for people to understand, is that we need to make sure that we're not drawing the wrong conclusions from the evidence that we see.
Yeah.
Right. And that, oh, running is bad. No, like running is actually great, right? Like we're built to be good runners, right?
Yeah.
It's, am I doing it? Like, have I earned the right to be at this intensity or at this duration?
Right.
And like looking at that data regularly, right? And so I start training in this way and it's like, okay, I'm improving. I'm recovering well. Maybe I can add some intensity. Maybe I can add duration. Oh, you know what? I'm not recovering super well. Do I need to back off? Do I need to add something in? Is there another factor, right? Do I need to get better sleep? Do I need to work on stress management so that I can handle load better? Instead of just having a conclusion of, you know, high intensity is bad or running is bad or cycling is bad or, you know, strength training, any of those things. I think when we struggle with those things, we assume that our body is broken or that the activity itself is just like, oh, bodies weren't meant to do that. And the truth is our bodies are incredibly adaptable across a lifespan. So many of the diseases of aging are really diseases of limited activity, right? And so again, our bodies are highly adaptable across our lifespan. And so if we are just, you know, we get good data, so we know where we're at, right? Good data in terms of what's happening metabolically, in terms of strength, capacity like that. And then also we're looking at the data from how our bodies respond to training and then regularly kind of rerunning those experiments, right? We're just always running these little mini experiments with our health and fitness. And then based on how our bodies respond, again, do I need to pull back a little bit? Do I need to add a little bit more? Do I need to look at something else? You know, these lifestyle factors that contribute to my ability to handle training load. And looking at it that way can help us identify, again, what am I doing really well that's already working? What can I add in a sustainable way? And then how do I make this work over the long term? And doing that, like you said, with that client, you saw this amazing change in her health, but not just in her health, in her confidence, in her ability to interact in meaningful ways with her family and loved ones again. That is where the rubber hits, or that's where the magic happens.
Yeah.
When it's I have a transformation, not just in my body, but in my self-image.
Yeah. And then capacity to live life on your terms again, instead of being dictated to by your body, what you can and can't do. Yeah. It's super powerful to unlock that door for people of letting them be in control of what they do. But so much of that is that mindfulness and awareness, taking time to think about the big picture of your training and how am I feeling? What's going on? Am I improving? You know, asking yourself those questions. So zooming out every now and again and being mindful about it. So if you're working with patients, with clients that you're kind of coaching or guiding along this journey, help them zoom out and say, how am I doing? Is it working? How am I feeling? Am I, you know, getting those niggles, those little injuries, those things building up? Or am I feeling pretty good? Where can I improve? Where can I push? Versus where do I need to pull back? Helping people to have that mindfulness is really important. And I think part of our role as someone that's in kind of a coaching position, that we help them improve that mindfulness of where they're at. And that's one of the reasons why I love the CardioCoach, is it applies some objectivity to that mindfulness. Because often we can kind of lie to ourselves a little bit of where am I at? Am I improving? I may be improving in my consistency or my, I can improve in some areas, but it is the total sum of what I'm doing helping me to improve? And getting some objective numbers from a metabolic test that will show me my VO2 max has improved or it hasn't improved, or my fat burning capacity has increased. My ability to sustain workload has increased. I did the same test and I was able to last 2 minutes longer. My VO2 max went up a little bit, or maybe not that much, but I could sustain those high workloads for a lot longer. Awesome. There's lots of ways to measure improvement on a VO2 test. And so having those objective numbers to bear that out allows us to be more insightful with kind of those mindfulness activities of that self-examination of where I'm at with my training.
Absolutely. Awesome. Talked a lot.
Well, because the sad part is we could go on all day. Like
I was like, what about the, we'll end. Anyway, hopefully that gives you a better idea of really kind of the inner workings of your body and how to look at your training in a way that allows you to drive the adaptations that you're looking for, but be flexible enough to adapt to life as it happens. And so thanks so much for joining us. As always, remember, if you want more content like this, remember to like, follow, and subscribe, and we will catch you next time. Ready to take your metabolic testing to the next level? Visit KORR.com to learn more about purchasing our metabolic test equipment.